They say the quiet ones are the ones you should watch out for. I used to laugh at that, until the day I made a Fortune 500 company beg for my return ***. My name is Sierra Langston. I am 38, born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and for the last 7.5 years, I was the senior infrastructure engineer at a mid-sized but rising tech firm called CodexaLogic. I was the woman behind the scenes, the one whose name was never in press releases, whose face was never on company banners, but whose work kept the digital heart of the company beating. I never craved the spotlight. I craved stability, control, and systems that hummed like a well-tuned engine. And for a long time, I had that. Until, of course, they decided disruption was sexier than reliability. ***. I remember when I first joined CodexaLogic. We were barely past Series B funding, still growing out of rented server closets and shared logins. I helped transition us to secure cloud infrastructure, built our failover architecture from scratch, and implemented multi-tiered access protocols that protected everything from payroll to procurement. I do not say this lightly. If it blinked, buzzed, or backed up, it ran through something I built. I had earned my place, not with noise, but with uptime. But over the last year, something started to shift. Quietly at first. Then all at once. Familiar faces were being replaced with cheaper, louder, and flashier alternatives. Engineering veterans were resigning. New hires did not understand our internal stack, and worse, they did not care to learn. We were bleeding knowledge, and no one at the top seemed to notice. Or worse, they did not care. ***. The shift came with a change in leadership, as it often does. Bryce Halden was hired as our new VP of Technology. He came from some fintech startup in San Francisco that tanked after 2 years, but you would not know it from his resume. He walked into the all-hands meeting like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs, slick haircut, custom-tailored navy suit, and that nauseating mix of confidence and cluelessness that only certain men seem to possess. On his first day, he introduced himself by saying, "We are here to break the old to build the new. Engineers think in limitations. Disruptors think in possibilities." That was the moment I knew we were in trouble. At first, I tried to stay open-minded. Maybe he had some fresh perspective. Maybe he could bring in resources or funding that would make our systems even better. But within weeks, he began unraveling the very architecture that kept our company running. His obsession with buzzwords, agile, zero trust, microservices, containerization, was not rooted in understanding. It was branding. He wanted to replace stable systems with shiny frameworks, even if they had no real use case for our operations. And the worst part? The board loved him. They ate up every slide deck, every promise of digital reinvention, while the rest of us cleaned up the mess behind the curtain. I started documenting everything. Not out of fear. Out of instinct. I knew what was coming. Bryce started cutting the budget for infrastructure. He slashed maintenance contracts. He laid off 2 of my best sysadmins under the excuse of team consolidation. He even proposed phasing out our proprietary asset tracking engine, something I personally wrote, to replace it with a third-party vendor that had already failed a pilot test 2 years ago. I raised the alarm in our review sessions, warning that ripping out foundational tools without understanding their dependencies would destabilize everything. His response? "We will build back better. We have to embrace a fail-fast mindset." Fail fast, huh? I remember thinking, he has no idea how close he is to living that philosophy. I kept my cool. I kept my meetings short. I smiled during reviews and held my tongue in group chats. But in the background, I was quietly preparing. I had written half of the systems that kept our data secure and our operations flowing. Many of those systems had biometric triggers, coded redundancies, and internal locks that only I could access. Not out of ego, but because I was the only one trained and cleared to use them. Bryce did not know that. And no one bothered to ask. My badge still scanned every door. My fingerprint still authenticated encrypted backups. And my code still ran deep through CodexaLogic's veins. I was not planning revenge. But I was ready. In case the fools running the ship decided to throw the captain overboard. I spent nights staring at dashboards, watching performance logs, wondering how long before it all cracked. I could see the signals. Packet loss where there used to be perfect pings. Alerts about modules timing out because someone messed with the core dependencies. My team had been stripped down to just me and a junior engineer fresh out of college who had never configured a production firewall before. Every time I asked for resources, I was told to lean into innovation. Every time I warned of an upcoming failure, I was accused of fearmongering. It was almost laughable. Almost asterisk by the time they called me into HR that rainy Thursday morning, I was not even surprised. Disappointed, yes. Angry, definitely. But surprised? Not at all. They thought they were cutting loose dead weight. They had no idea they were about to lose the one person who had been holding the whole damn thing together. It did not take long for Bryce Halden to start pulling levers he did not understand. Barely 2 weeks into his tenure, he called a department-wide meeting to announce his operational streamlining initiative. That was code for slashing the server operations budget by almost half. 40%, to be exact. I remember sitting in the back of the conference room, arms crossed, trying not to react as he spoke in circles about modernizing infrastructure, shifting to a lean model, and eliminating inefficiencies. What he was really doing was gutting the very systems that kept CodexaLogic functional. And the worst part? He did not even bother to consult the people who actually built those systems before swinging the axe. His next move was even worse. He laid off 3 out of the 4 sysadmins I had personally trained over the years. These were not just employees. They were people who knew the pulse of our environment, who could spot an incoming failure 5 hours before an alert ever hit. A screen. Gone. Just like that. One of them, Rachel, had just had a baby. Another, Mike, had relocated cross-country just a year earlier because he believed in what we were building. Bryce let them go with the same detachment someone might have when unsubscribing from a newsletter. Cold. Efficient. Disconnected from any real understanding of what he was breaking. The worst came when he called me into a one-on-one and said, proudly, that we would be phasing out legacy dependencies. He said it like he was freeing us from some old curse. In reality, he was ripping out our payroll engine, the entire inventory tracking module, and half of our VPN authentication structure, all of which had custom integrations deeply embedded into our backend systems. I tried to explain that these were not just plug-and-play components. They were tightly coupled with our access management, vendor payment pipelines, and remote access tools. Removing them would not just cause a hiccup. It would cause an avalanche. But he brushed me off with that same smug grin he always wore when pretending to listen. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. We will just migrate everything to a Kubernetes native solution, he said, like it was the answer to world peace. I stared at him in disbelief. We had no DevOps team left. None. He had just laid off the only people qualified to build and maintain the orchestration layer he was talking about. It was like watching someone cut the wings off a plane mid-flight and then insist we would still make it to the runway by gliding. When I pointed this out, he rolled his eyes and said, we will contract out what we need. Speed is more important than over-engineering. That is when it hit me. This was not ignorance anymore. This was sabotage. I was being positioned as the fall guy for a crash he had already set in motion. From that point on, every meeting became a performance. Bryce would throw out trendy tech phrases, half of which did not apply to our architecture, and nod along like a TED Talk speaker while ignoring every red flag I raised. I told him our asset tracker was tied directly to procurement, and without it, our supply chain requests would vanish into a black hole. He replied with, that is just old thinking. We need an API-first mindset. I said ripping out the custom VPN module would break secure access for remote engineers. He waved it off with, zero trust networks are the future. He was building a skyscraper with no foundation and calling it innovation. Meanwhile, I was expected to keep it all upright with duct tape and prayers. What made it all worse was that the rest of leadership either believed him or were too afraid to push back. The CTO, who should have known better, was too preoccupied with shareholder updates. The finance team was thrilled by the cost savings, at least on paper. And HR? Well, they were just happy not to be on the chopping block for once. I started documenting everything, backing up logs, and storing copies of emails where I outlined the risks. Not because I wanted to be dramatic. Because I had seen this movie before, and I knew exactly how it ended. My daily routines changed. I stopped trying to fight him in meetings. Instead, I let him talk. I let him dig deeper into his mess while I made quiet notes. I also started reinforcing some of the deeper level security protocols in the background. Not sabotage. Just smart fail-safes. Some of those systems were never designed to run without oversight. And that oversight, like it or not, was me. I had written the code. I had calibrated the keys. And I knew the consequences of ripping out one wrong dependency. He did not. And honestly, at that point, I think he did not care. I went from being the go-to engineer to the invisible one almost overnight. Bryce stopped including me in architecture discussions. He looped in contractors from a third-party firm who barely understood our internal naming conventions, let alone our security configurations. One even emailed me asking what Codex Vault Root meant. That was our encrypted asset control node, something you do not poke unless you want a full-scale lockout. I responded with a single sentence, do not touch it. But I knew they would. Sooner or later, they would try to overwrite something critical, and the system would do exactly what I trained it to do, shut down. At that point, I realized I was no longer being ignored. I was being isolated. Set up. If things broke, Bryce would point the finger at me and say I refused to cooperate. If things somehow stayed intact, he would take credit for streamlining operations. Either way, I was expendable. That is when I made peace with what was coming. I stopped trying to stop the collapse. I just made sure, when it finally happened, they would need me a lot more than I would ever need them. The quarterly audit meeting was supposed to be a formality. Just numbers, charts, and a quick update to reassure leadership that everything was on track. But Bryce had other plans. He walked in with a fresh slide deck and that same plastic grin he always wore when he thought he was being visionary. Behind him was a consultant I had never seen before, someone from an outsourcing firm with more certifications than actual experience. They looked too smug for their own good. The title on the first slide read, CodexaLogic, Infrastructure Transformation, Phase 1. I already knew what was coming. But seeing it in bold font, projected on that glass wall, still made my stomach knot up. Bryce clicked through the slides like a kid showing off a science fair project. He outlined his plan to sunset what he called our archaic systems within 2 weeks. And by archaic, he meant stable, functional, secure. He pointed directly to a core module I had built myself, a proprietary encryption layer that handled payroll processing, contractor payments, and vendor authentication. That module had taken me 9 months to design and test, including biometric permissions, layered redundancies, and real-time auditing. It was not flashy. It was not something you brag about at tech conferences. But it worked. And more importantly, it protected sensitive financial pipelines. He wanted to kill it and replace it with an off-the-shelf solution that had already failed us in testing last year. When he opened the floor for feedback, I kept my tone steady. No panic. No sarcasm. Just facts. I explained that removing that module would result in immediate failures across multiple operational zones. Contractor payments would be blocked. Terminal logins at remote sites would fail to authenticate. Our asset tracker, which relied on that same encryption, would lose access to historical metadata. In plain terms, I told him that this change would not be a hiccup. It would be a full-body collapse. Bryce leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and gave me that infuriating smile. That is your fear talking, Sierra. Not your logic. We have to modernize, he said, as if he were the first person to ever utter the word in a tech meeting. I looked at him for a long second. Not because I did not have a response, but because I finally realized what this was. He was not listening. He never had been. I was not speaking to a leader. I was speaking to a brick wall, one that had dressed itself up in buzzwords and badges. So I nodded once and said nothing else. There was no use continuing. My job was not to convince him anymore. It was to prepare for what came after he broke everything. That night, I stayed late in the server room. Most of the office was empty, just the low hum of cooling fans and the faint click of my keyboard in the silence. I logged into the failover matrix, a multi-layered control system designed to protect critical modules in case of a catastrophic failure. Originally, it was built for external threats, power outages, DDoS attacks, zero-day vulnerabilities. But tonight, I was preparing for an internal one. I made a final modification to the heartbeat protocol of our encrypted backbone. A subtle change. Nothing malicious. Just a biometric validation trigger. One that required my fingerprint, retinal scan, and voice ID to fully reinitialize core services if they were tampered with. It was not sabotage. I was not planting malware or locking anyone out. I was simply ensuring that if Bryce or his contractors started getting things without understanding what they were touching, the system would protect itself. It would go into lockdown. And only I would know how to bring it back. Call it a failsafe. Call it insurance. Call it a line in the sand. Whatever it was, it gave me peace that night as I walked out of that building, past the security guard, who nodded at me like it was any other Thursday. In his mind, I was just another employee wrapping up a late shift. In mine, I had just sealed the last exit before the ship hit the iceberg. I slept well that night. Not because I enjoyed what was coming, but because I had done my part. I had warned them. I had laid it all out with numbers, timelines, and real-world consequences. They chose to ignore it. They chose Bryce. That was their decision. But the system? The system still remembered who built it. And it would remember who broke it. It happened at exactly 10:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Rain was tapping against the windows like a warning, soft but persistent. The sky outside was dark, the kind of gray that made everything feel colder than it really was. I had just refilled my coffee and was halfway through a performance dashboard when I saw Lila from HR walking toward my desk with that stiff, tight-lipped expression people wear when they are about to deliver bad news they did not write themselves. She motioned for me to follow her. I already knew what it was. You could feel the silence around you change in moments like that. It gets heavier. People stop typing. Eyes flick up from monitors but no one says a word. You are already halfway. Gone before they even say it. Lila led me into one of the smaller conference rooms. Bryce was already inside, leaning against the window with his arms crossed and that signature smirk on his face. He did not even pretend to be surprised. No performance. No false empathy. Just satisfaction. He was proud of this. Lila sat across from me, nervously fumbling with a folder. She mumbled about strategic restructuring and redundant roles like it was a script she had memorized at gunpoint. I listened quietly, watching Bryce out of the corner of my eye. He was not looking at me, he was watching the door. Like he was afraid I might bolt or explode. But I did neither. I just waited for her to finish, then nodded. I understand, I said. That was it. She slid the severance documents toward me, hands shaking slightly, and asked for my laptop. I pulled it from my bag and placed it on the table, then typed in the requested credentials when they asked. No drama. No games. I even left the security tokens on the desktop in a clearly labeled folder. I wanted them to see I had nothing to hide. Because I didn't. But what they did not realize was that I also had nothing to lose. And in tech, that is a dangerous thing, especially when the systems you are firing someone from were built by that very same person. What they failed to do, in their rush to get rid of me, was properly revoke access. Sure, they disabled my email. And revoked VPN credentials. But my biometric key, my actual physical authorization, was still tied into 6 core systems. It was not just a login. It was an embedded security handshake, linked to the core failover chain I had configured over years. No one else had admin rights over it. Not even Bryce. That was intentional. Back when we first scaled CodexaLogic's infrastructure, we agreed. There needed to be a single, secure identity to bridge all mission-critical systems. That identity was mine. It was supposed to be a position of trust. But now it was something else entirely. As I gathered my things, I made sure to leave my employee badge on the table. I figured it was a formality. But Lila never actually scanned it out of the system. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she thought IT would handle it later. Either way, the access control list still showed active when I checked that evening. They had walked me out of the building without closing the door behind me. Rookie mistake. But honestly, I was not even angry in that moment. I was calm. Too calm. Because I knew something they did not. The clock had already started ticking. I stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, walked across the parking lot, and did not look back. It was not sadness I felt. It was relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop holding back. I had done my part. I had warned them. documented everything, followed procedure. And now? Now it was their turn to learn what happens when you tear down a house without checking which beams are load-bearing. I was not out for revenge. I was done with all that. But consequences? Consequences were inevitable. That night, I sat on my couch with a blanket, a glass of wine, and my laptop. I logged into a private console, not company-owned, but linked through a secure third-party dashboard I had created for redundancy monitoring. Everything was still online, still humming. But not for long. The biometric trigger I set just 24 hours earlier was now the last line of stability. If any critical module was touched, altered, or restructured without the correct sequence of biometric inputs, the system would lock itself down. Hard. And no contractor in the world could brute force their way through it. They would need me. Not because I wanted them to, but because the infrastructure was designed to require trust. And right now, they had none. The rain continued outside, steady and cold. Somewhere in that building, Bryce was probably celebrating. Toasting to a future he thought he was building. But I knew better. By firing me, he had removed the only person who knew how to keep that future from crashing before it even began. It started slowly, like a ripple in a still pond. At 11:07 a.m., just 25 minutes after I was walked out with a forced smile and a recycled box of office supplies, the badge readers in Building B stopped responding. At first, security thought it was a network hiccup, happens all the time. But by 11:10, their terminals went dark too. Staff could not enter labs, managers were locked out of restricted areas, and the failover backup kicked in, only to loop back into the same authentication failure. The system was not just malfunctioning, it was rejecting them. Actively. Deliberately. And no one could figure out why. By 11:19, the vendor portal started spitting out 403 errors across the board. Third-party suppliers were locked out mid-session. File push requests were denied. 2-year vendor contracts with automated billing modules froze in place. One of the procurement analysts tried to override it manually, but the interface required a secondary token. That token? It had been tied to my biometric profile since early 2022. Another layer Bryce never bothered to understand, let alone change. He thought security was just a firewall and a password rotation policy. But real infrastructure? Real architecture? It knows who built it. And it remembers when it is betrayed. The VPN issue hit next. By 11:28, all secure tunnels began auto-terminating. After 15 seconds. Engineers could not sync remote code bases. Analysts in satellite offices were kicked out of dashboards mid-query. DevOps teams, what little remained after Bryce gutted them, were locked in an endless loop of re-authentication failures. The log files later showed what I already knew. The key exchange sequence had been interrupted due to a missing biometric pulse. Mine. Without that signal, the servers shifted into protection mode. Not crash mode. Not error mode. Protection. Because they were built to endure the worst kind of threat, not from outside, but from inside. The procurement index timed out indefinitely around 11:31. No asset logs, no purchase orders, no hardware requisitions. Even the internal audit logs went blank, caught in a recursive sync delay. One by one, the systems that made CodexaLogic hum began to flicker, like a city grid losing power in stages. Bryce probably thought it was a network glitch. Maybe he called his consultant team into the war room and told them to restart services. Maybe he even blamed the old systems, like always. But what he could not grasp was that nothing was failing. The systems were functioning exactly as they were supposed to. Without trust, they locked themselves down. You see, 3 years ago, I implemented a failsafe during a major refactor. Not out of paranoia, but out of protocol. CodexaLogic's leadership had been concerned about external breaches, and I had argued that insider threats were just as dangerous. So I designed the backbone to require a live biometric handshake every 30 days. As long as I remained employed, that signal stayed active. It was like a heartbeat, quiet, steady, never noticed. But remove the source, and the body panics. Shuts down to preserve itself. I documented all of it. Presented it twice in quarterly audits. Even gave Bryce the option to shift it to a shared key sequence. He laughed. Said we would just cloudify the whole mess someday. Now the mess was laughing back asterisk while they scrambled to restore access. I watched the error traffic build from a private monitoring node I kept for QA scenarios. Legal? Gray area. Malicious? Not at all. I was no longer in their system. I had no access, no commands to input, no strings to pull. The system was simply doing what I had trained it to do, respond to signals it trusted. Without that trust, it shut its doors. It did not burn. It braced asterisk calls started trickling in. Old coworkers. Former engineers. Even one of the senior PMs who used to side-eye me in meetings but now sounded like he had seen a ghost. They wanted to know if I had heard about the outage. If I knew why everything was going dark. I told them I had not logged into a company terminal since the morning. Which was true. I told them I had nothing to do with the situation. Also true. But I did not tell them the last thing I had done the night before, when I configured the heartbeat to expire in exactly 14 hours unless revalidated by my key. I had warned them. They had laughed. Now the system was the one doing the talking. It was like watching a slow-motion avalanche from a safe, elevated cliff. The deeper CodexaLogic slid into chaos, the quieter my world became. By 1:15 p.m., Bryce had called what he probably imagined was a decisive emergency Zoom meeting. Problem was, half the department could not log in. The invite bounced for some, the conference server refused connections for others, and for the lucky few who made it in, the audio was patchy and the screen share kept freezing mid-frame. I imagine Bryce pacing like a stressed-out pelican, demanding status updates from teams that could barely communicate. Slack was already a disaster by then. Notifications were stuck in limbo, messages came in out of order, and the API was spitting out raw JSON errors instead of functioning properly. Someone probably tried to reroute traffic through a debug container, which only made things worse. At 1:27, the AWS backup container failed to mount. The logs showed it was due to a missing decryption token, the same one tied to a now invalid certificate that Bryce forgot to renew. I had flagged that cert 6 months ago, but he ignored the renewal protocol in favor of a unified identity fabric that was nothing more than a fancy buzzword from a white paper he skimmed. By 2 p.m., they lost full write access to the internal file repository. Engineering could no longer commit new builds, QA could not push test reports, and finance was completely locked out of the invoice directory. What made it worse was that read-only mode was not a glitch. It was a failsafe. The system was designed to go passive the moment trust verification failed. No deletes. No changes. No data corruption. Just lockdown. It was waiting for a specific handshake from a specific profile. One that no longer worked there. The system was not broken. It was secure. Exactly as I built it. As all of this unfolded, I was sitting in a quiet cafe across the river from downtown, halfway through updating my LinkedIn profile. Recently transitioned from CodexaLogic after 8 years leading critical infrastructure and zero downtime deployment systems. Open to consulting opportunities. I added a few key certs, some bullet points about disaster recovery architecture, and hit publish. Within 20 minutes, I had 5 DMs from recruiters and one from an old CTO I had not spoken to in 3 years. I smiled, refreshed my coffee, and turned off notifications. Then my phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made me pause. It was from Monica Tran, our Chief Information Officer and one of the few people at CodexaLogic I actually respected. Monica was sharp, no nonsense, and had always backed me when upper management wanted to cut corners. She had been on sabbatical in Lisbon for 2 weeks and, from what I heard, was due back Monday. Her text was short. Just 6 words, "What did you build, Sierra?" I stared at the screen for a moment. Monica knew me better than most. She knew I never built anything without a reason. If a switch was hidden, it was for protection. If a system required biometric verification, it was because I had been burned before. She had once told me, always assume the next hire knows less than you. I had taken that to heart. CodexaLogic did not fall apart because I left. It fell apart because Bryce dismantled the support beams without understanding what they held up. I thought about texting Monica back. I thought about explaining how the failover heartbeat required a revalidation every 14 days, and how removing me without migrating the credentials triggered a zero-trust cascade. But I did not. Instead, I locked my phone and sat back. There was no gloating in that moment. No thrill. Just a quiet sense of inevitability. Like gravity pulling down something that had been teetering on the edge for too long. Inside CodexaLogic, the teams were likely tearing through old Confluence pages, looking for diagrams I had archived years ago. Maybe someone even dug up an old Slack thread where I had warned them, repeatedly, that removing human knowledge from a complex system without a handoff was corporate malpractice. But I was not there to say, "I told you so." I had already said it. Loudly. Clearly. They just were not listening. Now the silence was louder than ever. From what I heard later, the hour after Monica's text was when the real panic set in. Bryce, brilliant, blindingly arrogant Bryce, went into full meltdown mode. His plan? Throw money at the problem until it stopped making him look incompetent. By 3:30 that afternoon, he had contracted not one, not two, but three separate cybersecurity firms, all flown in or patched in remotely within the hour. They promised enterprise-grade incident response, forensic deep dives, real-time container inspection, and all the shiny terms that looked good on invoices but meant nothing if you did not understand the foundation. And Bryce did not. Not even a little. They rebooted container stacks like toddlers hitting a reset button on a frozen tablet. They wiped cache memory, killed persistent sessions, and even tried a full-scale reroute through a temporary proxy node in Arizona. But none of it worked. Not because the system was compromised, but because the system was protected, intelligently, intentionally, and legally. Every critical module that powered CodexaLogic's infrastructure had been gated through fingerprint-secured code branches. Not just admin credentials. Not just MFA. Literal biometric triggers embedded at the code level. No fingerprint match? No deploy. No decrypt. No dice. I had implemented it after a ransomware scare 2 years ago, when a third-party vendor exposed one of our internal drives to a vulnerability. Management had panicked and demanded something unhackable. So I gave them exactly what they asked for. A fortress with a single master key. Mine. Bryce had signed off on it back when he was still charming executives and making jokes in the break room. He never asked how it worked. He just wanted to check a compliance box and look good during the next audit. That decision came back to bite him. I later heard he cursed my name in 3 separate meetings that day. At one point, he allegedly slammed his hand on a table and shouted, "Why the hell would anyone design a system this complex?" One of the junior developers, fresh out of college, still hopeful, raised his hand and said, "Because she was protecting us from ourselves." That kid probably got benched for the rest of the week. But it was true. I had written over 70% of the back-end infrastructure code myself, and I had documented every key trigger. They just did not bother to read it. The most telling part of the story, though, came from someone I trusted, Samir, one of the last sysadmins I trained before Bryce gutted the department. He said that around 4:15 p.m., one of the contractors pulled Bryce aside and said something like, "You need the original engineer." That was when one of the junior devs, bless his heart, asked the question no one wanted to say out loud. "Can we just call her?" Apparently, the room went quiet. Dead quiet. Bryce clenched his jaw and said, "We do not negotiate with employees who abandon process." I laughed when I heard that. Abandon process? I had been the process. I wrote the protocols. I spent years future-proofing that system so that no one could take shortcuts, expose data, or lock us out again. And now that the keys were gone, they were realizing that redundancy meant more than having backups. It meant having people who understood what the hell they were doing. Monica, by this time, had apparently returned early from Lisbon. She walked into that mess of a command center and assessed the situation in about 10 minutes. I imagined she stood there, arms crossed, watching grown men run scripts they did not understand on machines they could not access. Then she asked the only question that mattered, "Has anyone called Sierra?" Bryce, in his perfect suit and smug silence, did not respond. But the silence said everything. Meanwhile, I was making dinner. Roasting vegetables, checking emails, replying to a recruiter from Toronto. I was not angry anymore. Not bitter. Just detached. I had done everything right. I had warned them. I had prepared them. I had even offered, months ago, to document every layer in person. But Bryce had said documentation was low priority. Now the fire was burning, and they were tossing water at the smoke. The system was not broken. It was doing exactly what it was told to do. And Bryce? He was the one locked out. I did not dance on the ashes. I really didn't. But if I am being honest, there was something deeply satisfying about watching everything Bryce had so casually dismissed come back to choke the very air out of his empire. From the comfort of my living room, sweatpants, herbal tea, and a humming laptop, I watched the fallout unfold in real time. CodexaLogic's press page stopped updating. The customer support portal went into permanent maintenance mode. Even the job listings disappeared. The machine I built had started folding in on itself, just as designed when triggered under stress with no internal override. Recruiters began showing up in my inbox like clockwork. 5 offers within the first 48 hours. One from a high-frequency trading firm in Chicago, another from a defense contractor in Maryland. Every message was more or less the same: we heard about the Codexa situation. Would love to talk. Funny how fast your value is recognized when someone else realizes they broke the thing you held together. I took my time replying. No rush. I knew CodexaLogic would be forced to reach out eventually. And sure enough, by day 2, the whispers had already begun. Monica called me from her personal number around 10 p.m. that night. No pleasantries, just a sigh and a tired laugh. You did not burn it down, did you? I smiled and said, no. I just stopped holding it up. She went quiet for a moment, then told me the board was in emergency session and reviewing recent leadership decisions, which was a nice corporate way of saying, Bryce is toast. She confirmed they had lost access to $1.3 million in vendor invoice processing. Field teams were unpaid. Critical procurement cycles were halted. At least 2 international deals were frozen mid-transfer. The system was locked at the bones. I did not celebrate. But I also did not lose sleep over it. Every safeguard I had put in place was logged, documented, and justified. Every system Bryce had arrogantly gutted was one I had warned him about. The truth is, I had always assumed something like this might happen, just not so soon. I had built the infrastructure to be resilient, but resilient with boundaries. There were thresholds. And when those thresholds were crossed, the system would lean into its defenses and wait. Not crash. Not explode. Just wait for the right key. That key was me. Day 3 was quieter. No direct calls, just a few accidental LinkedIn views from CodexaLogic executives I used to eat lunch with. The ones who went quiet the minute Bryce came in. Funny how none of them had anything to say when I was walked out of the building. But now? Now they were curious again. Regret makes people nostalgic. I got a text from Samir that afternoon. Just 2 words, they're drowning. I replied with a heart emoji and left it at that. By day 4, the call finally came. Private number. I let it ring twice before answering. Bryce's voice came through first, strained, forced, all bravado drained out of it. Sierra, hey. We were wondering if you'd be open to a conversation. I paused. Let the silence stretch. Then, as calmly as I could, I said, only if Monica is on the line too. He mumbled something and fumbled with the mute button. And within 30 seconds, Monica's voice joined in. We need your help, she said plainly. No corporate fluff. Just the truth. That is when I knew I had already won. Not because I brought them to their knees, but because I made them understand. Expertise is not just a line item on a spreadsheet. It is what keeps the lights on, the doors open, the clients paid. They had tried to replace me with empty slogans and shiny ideas, and now they were learning, painfully, that systems do not respond to buzzwords. They respond to architecture, to knowledge, to trust. So I said, I'll help. But on my terms. And I meant every word. I did not respond to Bryce's desperate call. Not that night. Not the next day. I made them sit with it. Let them stew in the dark of their own ignorance, because honestly, they needed to learn that lesson. When the official board request arrived in my inbox late that evening, complete with an apology masked in corporate jargon, I replied with one sentence, please direct all communication through my attorney. They wanted my attention? Fine. But they were going to pay for it, properly and publicly. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the next morning. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a charcoal blazer and quiet confidence. My lawyer, Delaney Shore, was already there, crisp as ever, ready with the contract we had drawn up the night before. I did not bother with small talk. I let the silence speak. Across the screen were 8 directors, most of whom had voted to give Bryce free rein just a few months ago. Monica sat at the far end of the table, arms folded, expression unreadable. Bryce was not present. A smart move, but not smart enough. When they opened the floor to me, I kept it short. My terms are non-negotiable. I return as an external consultant, 6-month engagement, flat rate of $540,000 paid upfront, no oversight, no internal reporting chain. I will require full root access, biometric controls re-enabled, and the authority to bypass internal policy, if necessary to restore systems. One final condition: Bryce Halden is removed from his position immediately and permanently. Not reassigned. Removed. I watched their faces as I said it. Not one flinched. The chairman nodded and leaned forward. We accept. Just like that. 15 minutes in and the decision was unanimous. No haggling. No counteroffers. I had all the leverage and they knew it. They were not hiring a consultant. They were bringing back the only person who could breathe life into their digital skeleton. And they had no time left to pretend otherwise. I walked out of that meeting with everything I had asked for and more. Delaney handled the paperwork while I drove home in quiet satisfaction. Not glee. Not revenge. Just the cold, clean satisfaction that comes from knowing you were right and they finally recognized it, publicly, contractually, and at great cost. By the time I got home, the first half of the payment had already hit my account. I poured a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and logged into the CodexaLogic control panel. It took exactly 4 seconds. The system recognized my biometric token instantly. The red alerts on the dashboard shifted, one by one, into stable greens. Services that had been locked out for days began to cascade into operational states. Logs updated in real time, dependency chains unblocked, dormant queues processed. It was like flipping a master switch inside a machine that had just been waiting for the right touch. It had not failed. It had waited. At 9:26 p.m., I reauthorized the primary vendor ledger queue. At 9:34, I unsealed the encrypted backup mount. At 9:41, I reset the access tree for procurement requests and restarted the contractor payment cycle. By 10 o'clock, the system had stabilized across 5 major services. Just like that. No fanfare. No applause. Just one person, doing what she was always capable of doing, when given the trust and space to do it. Bryce never contacted me again. I heard through Monica that he was escorted out the same afternoon, still insisting this was all some engineering sabotage, as if systems break themselves out of spite. In truth, he was not evil. He was ignorant. And worse, arrogant. A dangerous combination when you are in charge of something as fragile and precise as a digital ecosystem built over years of effort. He underestimated the infrastructure. He underestimated me. That was his tombstone. I did not stay late that night. I powered down my laptop, turned off the lights, and let the system hum peacefully on its own. No chaos. No stress. Just order. I had given them a simple choice, my terms or their tombstone, and they chose wisely. It took me 6 hours to stabilize the entire environment. Not just the core services, but the fragile interlinks between modules that no one else even realized were connected. 8 hours in, and full access had been restored, every badge reader synced, every vendor portal authenticated, every encrypted node handshaked and verified. By sunrise, CodexaLogic was not only back online. It was operating faster, cleaner, and more secure than it had in 2 years. The silence on the network was a good kind of silence, the kind that means nothing is breaking. Monica called me just before 7 a.m. Her voice was soft, almost grateful. Thank you, Sierra. I mean it. She did not ask for details, and I did not offer any. She knew better than most how close they had come to irreparable collapse. Bryce's office was cleaned out by noon. I never saw him again. Some said he tried to shift the blame. Others said he took a mental health leave. I did not care. There was nothing left for me to prove to him, or to anyone else for that matter. The system worked because I built it that way. I warned them. They chose not to listen. They paid the price. I walked through the office later that afternoon. Just once. just to see the place from the outside, now that I was no longer part of it. The faces had changed. The energy had shifted. A few of the new IT staff, the ones Bryce brought in to replace my team, actually stood up when they saw me. Some nodded. One even said quietly, "Glad you're back." That caught me off guard, not because I needed validation, but because it felt real. Like maybe, just maybe, the lesson had finally landed. And what was that lesson, exactly? It was not just about me or what they lost when they let me go. It was bigger than that. You do not slash the roots and expect the tree to bloom. You do not replace seasoned engineers with buzzwords and expect the system to stay standing. And above all, you never, ever gamble against the person who designed the locks and still holds the only key. Not when that person warned you. Not when she gave you every chance to do the right thing. I stayed on the contract for the full 6 months. Kept my head down, did the job, took the checks. I trained no one. I documented everything. I left behind a hardened infrastructure with auto-healing protocols, layered auth cycles, and encrypted audit trails no one could tamper with, not even me. I made sure of that. Because I did not want them to rely on me again. I wanted them to finally respect the work it took to keep them operational in the first place. On my last day, Monica met me in the lobby. She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten thank you note and a black metal key. "Figured you earned the real one," she said. I smiled, but I did not take it. I left it on the table between us. "I don't need keys anymore. The system knows who I am." She laughed, and for the first time in a long while, so did I. Driving home that evening, I felt something I had not felt in months: peace. Not revenge. Not even satisfaction. Just peace. Because I did not have to burn the place down to prove my worth. All I had to do was leave. And when the cracks formed and the walls shook, the truth became impossible to ignore. I did not build CodexaLogic's foundation for glory or credit. I built it so it would last. So when they came crawling back, it would still be standing, waiting for the only person who could unlock its doors. I was not proud of the pain I caused. But I was proud of the reckoning it delivered. And if they remembered nothing else about me, I hope they remembered this: do not disrespect the ones who keep the lights on just because they do not sit at the head of the table. And do not confuse quiet strength with irrelevance. Because the ones you ignore today might just be the ones you beg for tomorrow.